Welcome back to our examination and exploration of material culture of the Archaic period. The material culture that we're going to look at today is coinage, pottery, and then sculpture. We will try to not only look at the development of these artifactual categories, but also place them in their appropriate social and political context. So, up until the 7th century BCE, we have been using the phrase quote unquote trade and exchange pretty deliberately. That is because we cannot make safe distinctions between what was bartered, i.e., traded by exchange of goods and without the use of money, or changed hands as a result of gift exchange. Up until the 7th century BCE, the Greek world was a pre-monetary society where barter was king. There's actually an ongoing discussion about the use of ingots as currency equivalents. But since the weight of these ingots that I'm showing you here on the slide does not seem to be standardized, the discussion becomes difficult to conclude. Money is a prime example of a cultural construct. That is an idea or concept that is culturally defined but has real-world consequences. The story of money begins in 7th century Lydia. Lydia was the cultural homeland of Lydians, a group of Indo-European speaking people. Lydia developed actually out of the dissolution of the Hittite state at the end of the Bronze Age. And as far as evidence for Lydians is concerned, we kind of have to rely on Greek accounts about them, which are not always accurate. But this is what we know, is that the Lydians were the inventors of money. They took electrum, an alloy of gold and silver, and struck them with state symbols to ensure a standard value that was not affected by the fluctuations in the proportion of silver versus gold. How was it done? Well, a blank was placed in between two dies, and then a person in charge of minting would strike a hammer, and voila, the coin has been struck and it's ready to be used. Currency facilitated trade, especially large payouts by the state and building projects. But we would be foolish to think that since money was introduced, the barter system disappeared altogether. Actually, the two systems were used simultaneously, even after political decisions by states ended barter. The invention of money gave emerging city-states a powerful tool in controlling trade, and the Greek cities jumped on the bandwagon pretty fast in the 6th century. Soon, money becomes one of the most powerful media for the expression of state identity and, of course, state propaganda. Officials scour the city's history, legends, puns on the name, mythology, and whatnot to come up with representations to place on their coins. Gods, like Poseidon, for the Macedonian coin of the 3rd century, or minor deities, like the water nymph Arethusa, mythical creatures, like Pegasus, on this coin from Corinth, or mythical symbols like the labyrinth for Knossos, become powerful symbols that tell a story about the city-state that they represent. Metals had always made the world go round. In the Bronze Age, it was the hunt for metals that stimulated the trade and exchange across regions and integrated the Mediterranean state mosaic. In the Dark Ages, the lack of metal transforms the technology and the social system, and metals remain ever so popular. And now with the currency made out of metal, metal continues to be king. It is perhaps hard to understand the power of metals, even for us archaeologists, because metals are not usually found in abundance in excavations, in direct contrast with pottery or other materials. But metals were never out of the picture, at least in the higher echelons of society. But let's ask this question. Why are we not finding them? Well, the main drivers behind this metal scarcity in the archaeological record is on the one hand, recycling of metals, right? Which was always going on in times of need, and looting, which is not just a contemporary problem. It was an ancient problem as well. Despite this scarcity, metal objects were always part of the aristocratic household and part of the aristocratic gift exchange. A few decades ago, in a heated debate over the value of pottery, Michael Vickers poignantly used the analogy of Tupperware or plastic dinnerware as opposed to formal china to explain the relationship between metal and pottery shapes. It is unquestionable that the filthy rich would always take out their metal wares in formal celebrations and feasts, a tradition that created a need for such artifacts, a need, of course, that various workshops tried to satisfy. Among the most renowned was the Laconian workshop, or else the Spartan workshop, which produced and exported metal artifacts such as this tripod from the Metropolitan Museum of Art. Another example of metalwork from a Laconian workshop is the so-called Vix crater, which was found in an unlooted grave of a noble woman in northern Burgundy in France. Her grave was stocked with imported metal stuff from the Greek and Etruscan world, and all of them related to wine drinking, including, of course, this character, which was the equivalent of a punch bowl for the Greeks. By the way, the Greeks did not drink wine undiluted and always cut their wine with water to reduce its strength and avoid quick inebriation during the drinking parties, the symposia. The symposion was the quintessential Greek drinking party where men would get together in a special room of the house, recline on couches, nibble on food snacks, and drink and discuss and have a good time all night. This custom was one of the borrowings from the Eastern Mediterranean and became as Greek as the Parthenon itself. The symposium was a male bonding experience. But wait, you might say, look at this lady in the middle of the drinking party. Well, let me put it this way. Women of good reputation should not be seen in the symposium. Even though slave women and boys were entertaining and serving the drinking men, and escorts, called hetaira, would entertain them with their charms, be they intellectual or sexual. The symposium drives pottery production just as much as athletics, with their demand on a ribaloi, and in this period, symposium-related shapes become very popular. So here's the recipe for wine for the symposium. Buy wine or bring it over from your farm. If you buy it, it has probably been transported in one of these bad boys, these amphorae that had an elongated shape and a special pointy base that facilitated transport on ships. After you get it from the market or from your farm, you store it in these amphorae with a base, right? And keep it there until it's time for the party. You also send your girls, right? The girls of the house, to get water from the spring with a hydria or a water jug. Combine the wine and the water in a ratio 1 to 3 or 1 to 6, your preference, in a crater. After wine and water are well incorporated, serve it with a ladle or an oinokoe, a small wine pitcher, in a wine drinking cup of your choice. Supply your guests with snack foods like dried fruits, nuts, as well as other delicacies. The Kylix in particular becomes a favorite drinking cup, with all sorts of drinking games designed around it. Drinking elegantly from a Kylix was not an easy thing. Try it if you don't believe me. Try drinking from a soup plate with a narrow rim, right? And please report back to us. And of course, the more inebriated one gets, the more difficult drinking from it without spilling all over yourself it gets. Or easier, who knows. Therefore, kylixes start becoming important shapes in the production of certain workshops, like for instance the Laconian workshop that I showed you in the previous slide and this one. Laconian workshops seem to have been very active in the 6th century and seem to die off after the so-called Lycurgus reforms that produced the type of Spartan society that we think of nowadays, especially after watching the first 300 movie. And if you have not seen the movie, I am talking about a society that was very strict, militaristic, but at the same time trans-egalitarian, with relative gender equality, but closed off and extremely xenophobic. But we're not there yet. In the meantime, the Laconian potters and vase painters had to compete with two other workshops, the Athenian and the Corinthian. The Corinthian workshop in the 7th century had innovated and was a forerunner with the invention of the black figure and orientalizing style. In competition, though, with the Athenian potters, Corinthians continued to produce pottery for the Mediterranean markets, i.e. the new colonial installations, as well as non-Greek markets, such as the Etruscan one in Italy, basically the area of modern-day Tuscany north of Rome. Towards the end of the 6th century, Corinthians add a reddish slip on their pots as background, and that was done to imitate the Attic stuff, which were increasingly more popular. Actually, Athens invited foreigners to the city, especially craftsmen who wanted to move to the city and practice their craft in the 6th century. It is probably this migratory pattern that produces the craftsmen, the Athenian potters, that were able to marry the two traditions, the Athenian and the Corinthian one, and produce really distinctive pots. This marriage was to produce a new type of pottery that puts Athens ahead of the game and definitely in front of Corinth. The potter Nearchos, who is the producer, the potter who have produced this lovely aribalos, is a good example of this marriage of traditions, as he combines in this particular aribalos the Corinthian miniature painting tradition, right? Also, a Corinthian shape, the aribalos, right, the oil flask, and Attic clay, and voila, a type of pottery that made Niarchos very, very wealthy. A similar case of intermingling traditions is the so-called Francois vase that I would like you to remember. The Francois vase is a crater and was found in an Etruscan tomb. The arrangement of decoration in registers and the miniature style of painting is Corinthian, but the clay of the vessel is Attic, and we are sure that it was produced in Attica. As for the shape, It imitates a metallic crater, such as the one I showed you a little earlier from Vix in Burgundy. This particular vase is famous for its iconography. Each register is a different storyline. The most famous of all is the register that depicts the wedding of Peleus and Thetis, a wedding between a goddess, Thetis, and a remarkable mortal, Peleus, both of which were destined to bear one of the most famous Greek heroes, the hero Achilles. The Francois vase actually bears two signatures of a potter and a painter, Clytias and Ergotimus. It also bears labels for each and every figure so that the mythological scene is correctly interpreted by the audience, as you see in the segment of the scene which shows you Peleus over here and Thetis in her wedding chamber. These innovative attitudes contributed to the aggressive expansion of Athens in the various foreign markets. Case in point, many Attic pots, including the Francois vase that we just talked about, were found in Etruscan tombs. Another innovative potter of Athens that I would like you to be familiar with is Exekias. Exekias was active between 545 and 530 BCE. As Near says, pots by Exekias let us know the kind of quality of pottery at the top end of the market. This eye calyx, right, is one of his most famous works. In the bowl, on a coral red background, one would be delighted with the representation of Dionysus in the pirate ship after he turned the pirates into delphins. Another important artist of the black figure painting scene was Amasis, whose name is a Greekicized version of an Egyptian name. He drew many sign pieces, of which I'm going to show you this one on the slide, which shows you a domestic scene with a bunch of women engaged in textile production, with many phases of the process depicted, like spinning on this side and weaving, of course. But black figure was not to last forever. Andokidis experiments and makes black figure sort of last year's fashion, right or between 530 and 515 BCE, so towards the end of the Archaic period. Andokidis produces the first instances of so-called red figure style in a series of bilingual vases that show the same scene in black figure and its negative, but not really, in red figure. Soon, all the potters in town would be producing red figure pottery and experimenting with the new creative horizons that it opened. The decorative possibilities are certainly exploited by Euphronius, who was active between 535 and 470 BCE. The red figure style lends itself well to the rendering of details and the imitation of depth and three-dimensionality, which Euphronius, as you can see in this crater, tries to attain. Another contemporary of Euphronius, and a fierce rival of his, was Euthymides, who was active between 515 and 500 BCE. Euthymides also experimented with the possibilities of the new medium, especially with the depiction of movement of the human body and the three-quarter stance, as opposed to the profile or more rarely frontal view that other potters and painters executed on their vases. Especially the man in the center of this composition exemplifies both of these goals. That is, a more realistic depiction of movement of the human body and the three-quarter perspective. While all these potters and craftspeople were leaving their marks on the art world, the Greek world was brewing around them. Undoubtedly, the Archaic period was a period of dynamic economic expansion, but at the same time, it was a dynamic period of social and political restructuring because the structures that were in place had resulted in a social and economic landscape with a lot of stark inequalities. Inequalities that had left a lot of people destitute or landless, right, which was the equivalent of destitute in agricultural society, while other families had become very wealthy, right, but at the same time had no access to power. At the same time, the aristocracy was trying to quell social unrest, right, and remain in power. Athens is a good case study for all of these processes that I just mentioned. The 6th century was a very dynamic one, and one that had set Athens to be a leading political power in the Greek world. It seems that in the beginning of the century, Athens was an aristocracy. That is, the leading noble families of Athens were the ones who were able to participate in government and other civic institutions and functions. If the formation of the polis was complete by the beginning of the 7th century BCE, the development of a rule of law instead of custom was in full progress. Important in these terms were the reforms implemented by the lawgiver Solon in the beginning of the century, as well as those by Cleisthenes at the end of it. And in between them, tyranny. Solon, according to the sources, seems to have inherited a very polarized political and economic landscape, which he endeavored to regulate by giving the poorer classes of Athenian citizens a fair chance, or at least a fairer chance than before. He is said to have reformed the constitution of Athens, defining social classes according to financial brackets, and bringing the poor and the landless into the organization of the polis by giving them the right to vote and attend the assembly of citizens and the law courts. But polarization continued and resulted in the institution of a tyranny in Athens. Even though nowadays tyranny is deemed to be a cruel and oppressive rule, in ancient Greece tyranny was the rule of a person who did not have constitutional, i.e., hereditary claim to power. I remind you that the system was an aristocratic one, in which to rule and be involved in government, you needed to have been born into the right family. In the 7th and 6th century, tyrannies start popping up in various Greek city-states, in which political situations allowed ambitious and wealthy men without hereditary claim to power to take over and rule in the name of the oppressed. Of course, never underestimate the privileged class that managed to exploit mistakes and the excesses, of course, of tyrants, to topple them and give them a bad name forever. Win-win, right? So this is exactly the case of Pisistratus, the local tyrant in Athens, who came to power 3 times since he was ousted and exiled twice. During his time in office, Pisistratus became a populist champion of the lower classes, who opposed and reduced the political and economic power of the aristocracy, and focused on creating a more even distribution of power, political and economic, among the various classes of Athenians. He focused on infrastructure and started a very ambitious building program as a way to create economic opportunities for the lower classes. At the same time, he funded numerous religious and artistic programs, and I would venture out to say that Athens would never have become the power that it did without Pisistratus. And I'm not alone in giving Pisistratus a good grade. Both Herodotus and Aristotle agree that he was a good ruler and administrator who ruled Athens more like a constitutional government rather than a tyranny. But alas, the lethal combination of entitled kids and opposition of aristocratic families that were waiting in the wings to reclaim their privileges, right, gave Pisistratus a bad name. But after the end of his reign, things in Athens could not go back to the past, and a second bout of reforms by Cleisthenes transformed Athens into a democracy, the first of its kind. Cleisthenes' reforms are pretty awesome. If politics is your thing, I highly encourage you to look into his reforms. But for our purposes here, suffice to say that his reforms regarded three major, initiatives that made everybody equal before the law. So, he raised the power and the status of the lower classes in such a way, right, that made them eligible for office. Secondly, he gerrymandered the voting districts in such a way so that he can distribute political privilege and access to power to everybody. And three, he instituted lottery for the selection of officials for some offices. Last but not least, he instituted something that we call ostracism, which was essentially a temporary banishment of super powerful people so that they would not interfere with the balance of power. Note that ostracism was not a punitive measure, so you didn't really do anything to deserve an ostracism. Say what you will, but those were some pretty ballsy reforms. If pottery and coinage allow us to follow the developments of the creation of a new class of wealthy people, sculpture allows us to follow along with the emphasis of the aristocracy and the landed wealth. And when I say emphasis, I mean the values that the wealthy and the rich chose to highlight while putting up expensive dedications, so kouroi and chorai, to which we were introduced in the lecture on the 7th century. So let's start first by the kouroi, which were meant to symbolize the aristocratic ideal of manhood. And I'm saying aristocratic ideal because sculptures in the Archaic period were commissioned by noble and wealthy families as grave markers or as sanctuary dedications, which were meant to aggrandize their family. So even if this kouros, this nude and walking likeness of a young man of the Archaic period, was not meant to be a portrait of anybody in particular, it was certainly not the likeness of any Greek boy, but a boy of a prominent family or even a god. So in the Archaic period, each and every sculpture that is not commissioned by a city, that is, it's not part of a sculptural program of a temple, right? So if that's not the case, we are witnessing the active efforts of noble families to stay relevant. The kouros embodies many of the ideals of aristocratic males. The kouros is young, and most characteristically, he is nude. Since nudity is one of the distinctive features of athletes in ancient Greek world, the kouros is an athlete who has practiced and developed a beautiful body and a beautiful mind too. At the end of the day, the kouros is the attainment of the ideal of arete, which stood for individual excellence. The attainment of this ideal in real life was possible through engagement with sport, of course, and formal education, both of which you would find in the gymnasium, right? The high school / gym of the city. And that is, you would find them there if you were financially comfortable enough to be able to pay for instruction. Therefore, in every Greek city, Except Sparta, the Kouros is a representation of privilege. We have noted already the debt to Egyptian sculptures already, right? So let's move on and explore not only the artistic developments, but the other aspects of this phenomenon. So the New York Kouros that I've showed you a couple slides ago, and these twins here, Cleobis and Biton, represent early examples of Kouroi. In them, we see the symbolic representation of moving forward, of movement, right? Which is represented with our advancing leg. But I think that you agree with me that this is not a very successful representation of real movement. Even though their leg is advancing forward, both of their hips and their shoulders are squared. And as we all know, when a human walks, our body parts shift to complete the motion. Moreover, our musculature is three-dimensional and not 2D. Therefore, the challenge for artists in the Archaic period is to develop their artistic skills to express convincingly natural movement. And we see this over time, right? The challenge was met by the end of the century and especially the end of the Archaic period. The goal was attained, especially if we observe the Critios boy. His hips are not squared as the weight shifts from one side to another in the process of stepping forward. This new stance is called contrapposto, a term that I would like you to note down and keep it in the back of your heads and in your notes because we're going to encounter this term again. But let's now turn to the chori. The same process from abstraction to stylization to naturalism can be observed with the chori too, as we move from a very block-like and stylized rendering of the human form, as you can witness in the Berlin Chori, to a more naturalistic rendering of it that we see in the Peplos Chori and ultimately in the Acropolis Chori. One of the starkest differences between Kouroi and the Korai, right, the boys and the girls, is the clothing. Korai are very well covered and never naked. The ideal of femininity is an affluent, yet restrained, and well-guarded femininity. Here privilege does not empower the person, but the family who is in charge of the girl. One Kori that I would like you to remember by name is Frasiclia. Frasiclia was probably a funerary marker for poor Frasiclia who died young and unmarried. She was definitely from an affluent background, and there are suggestions that connect her to most one of the most prominent families in Athens, the Alcmaeonids. Her privileged background is plain for everybody to see in her clothes and jewelry, the elaboration of which can be seen with the naked eye. I mean, look at these clothes, right? They're elaborate, woven finely, and embroidered on top, right? Hardly the everyday clothes that women might wear while going about their business. Here's Frasiclia, what she would have looked like back in the day. And yes, if you're wondering about all these sculptures, yes, they were painted, which is a far cry from the blinding whiteness that they project today. And with Frasiclia and the other painted ladies, I will conclude this lecture on the material culture of the Archaic period. Join me next time for more on sanctuaries and temples, and thank you very much for your attention.